really differentiate yourself and also, bring special, have some sort of specialization. So I love that. I'm also thinking about like the listener who's maybe feels like they have a message on their heart. They want to make an impact. They feel like, oh man, ever since I was a kid, I knew I wanted
Yeah.
to share a message with the world, but I'm scared, or I'm not sure where to start, or I have some limiting beliefs. Like, what would you say to that listener who's like, man, I just don't know if I have what it takes even? Like, what would you say there?
Yeah, good question. So I'll give you two thoughts here. One is kind of the first part of your question there is I've got this message, I got this thing that I'm passionate about, this thing that I want to help people with, or maybe I had some type of crazy story, overcoming obstacles or whatever it may be. People are like, I want to share my story. I want to help other people, right? And that's all well and good, but there's an overlap between what you're interested in, what you're passionate about, what you're knowledgeable on, what you care about, and what is it that speakers are actually hired for in the marketplace. And the reality is, I don't say this to be mean or condescending in any way, is like you may have a crazy story, but nobody cares. Like a decision maker and an audience member, they're going like, yeah, that's crazy that happened to you. What does it have to do with me? What is that? How does that impact my life? How does that make some type of difference? And so just because like you had something that you overcame or accomplished doesn't mean the audience is like, yes, we would absolutely love to hear about all of your life achievements. Like nobody cares, right? And again, that's not a mean thing, but you just have to make sure that you're clear on how do you connect the dots between that and an audience who's trying to accomplish something similar, trying to get where you're at. So make sure that you're clear on that. The second part of the question there is like those limiting beliefs of going like, who am I? Right? Like, why should anyone listen to me? And I felt that before. I felt that early on. I think oftentimes I still feel that today. And I think that oftentimes that's something that never quite, that imposter syndrome never quite goes away. You're always going to have those small, quiet voices in the back of your head. And sometimes maybe they're louder than other times. And so I think that one of the ways that you build some of that confidence is over time, you do the thing, right? And so how do you get better? How do you get more comfortable? How do you get more confident when you're podcasting? You podcast. How do you get better and more confident as a writer? You write. Whatever the thing is, that you start to build some more confidence over time, knowing that, okay, I'm getting better at this. I'm improving at this. But I think it's important to remember any speaker that you look up to, you admire, you respect, it's easy to see where they are today and think, Tony Robbins, I can never be as good as Tony Robbins. Well, you're looking at Tony Robbins where he's 30, 40 years into the game, but you forget that like there was a time where he had done 0 gigs and then did his first gig. And he's done plenty of gigs that have gone really well and plenty of gigs that have sucked and everything in between. And so it's important just to remember that everybody starts from zero, starts from scratch, whether you want to be a speaker, an author, a writer, a podcaster, whatever. You had a time where you guys had done 0 episodes and then you did the first episode. I had the same, like I host a podcast and like I had done 0 episodes and then you do the first one, right? And so some of it just comes with time of doing the thing and knowing that like I'm an amateur, but I'm going to figure this out and I'm going to get better over time.
I love that. And I listened to you and Josh Shipp before I went into that very first speaking. I dedicated 300 hours of just dedicated speaking, volunteer in the classrooms inside of the school district. Because I remember hearing about like your 4-H and just like going to this little niche. My little niche was FBLA, yours was 4-H, and taking a lot of that to just as a playground, as a practice field. So can you just like kind of maybe take us back to Grant when you were starting, maybe in those 4-H experiences? I'd like to hear just some of the mess ups, like some of those mistakes that you kind of experienced and because I know what I experienced. I'd love to hear from you on some of that behind the scenes stuff that maybe I missed in the book,
Yeah, totally. And so, like I mentioned, I was a youth pastor for a little while. And so I had a lot of experience working with teenagers and students. I enjoyed working with that audience. And so when I was like, okay, I'm interested in doing more speaking, maybe doing this on a full-time level. Josh, that you alluded to, Josh Shipp was one of the guys who has been in the youth space for many, many years. And he was someone that I looked up to, admired, respected. When I go back to email and harassing, stalking a bunch of speakers, like he was definitely on that list and was was very helpful and replied back and gave me some good advice. In fact, the years and years ago, this is probably again like 15, 16 years ago, he had hosted a like a speaker training boot camp in Dallas. It's kind of the first first training that he had offered, and I went to that, and he and I connected there, and so it was super helpful just to see like, okay, here's someone who's doing this, and I found that. I found that this is still helpful today to look for people who are a step or two ahead of you in what you want to do, not light years ahead of you, but a step or two, because that was Josh for me, of feeling like, okay, like if he can do it, I can do it. Not that I'm great or he's, anything that is doing something that's unachievable, but it just gave me some sense of confidence that like, okay, there is a blueprint, there is a roadmap, there's a trail that someone else has paved here that I can follow to figure out as well. And so, yeah, Josh was definitely that for me. And so when I started reaching out to different events, you mentioned like the very first paid event that I did was this 4-H conference, and I 4-H, for people who aren't familiar, is like a student leadership group in agricultural and farming, and like I know nothing about agricultural farming, any of that type of stuff. I was a city kid, and so I just didn't know squat about that. But so I was a little intimidated going in, like, man, if you guys are asking me to like teach you about strategies for milking cows, like I got nothing. But what I found was like those students who came from rural parts of where they're from, they're teenagers to teenagers to teenager, and they're dealing with the same challenges and obstacles and limiting beliefs that any other teenager is. And so yeah, I did that first event in Missouri, which is where I'm from, and so I went and I spoke there. The gig went really, really well, and so basically I used that to try to leverage into other 4-H type of events. And so and this is still a strategy that works really, really well, is that you take a group like 4-H, or in your case, Mike, you mentioned FBLA. FBLA was another one I did a ton of work with. And a lot of those, especially on like a national association or a national organization, then it's broken down into, state or regional or district or local type of groups that are oftentimes maybe looking for a speaker. And again, like we touched on earlier, like event planners, decision makers are in the risk mitigation business. And so if I go speak at Missouri 4-H and it goes really, really well, and that Missouri 4-H director then writes a letter of recommendation or gives me a recommendation to some other 4-H people, it's like, well, if Grant did a good job for them and their audience is essentially the same as my audience in a different state, then Grant would probably do a good job for us. And so that's really what I did, and was able to book a few other state things, and then maybe that would open the door to some type of FBLA thing, and then that kind of rolled into some other stuff. So yeah, and in fact, I remember you mentioned FBLA. I remember, this is going to kind of connect a couple dots here, but one of an early event that I did was a referral from Josh. He was living in and still lives in California. I was living in Missouri. He was invited to do an event, a small little event in Oklahoma. And didn't make sense for him to do. They had a small little budget, a couple $100, and so he referred it to me. I go do the event, and the event goes really well. But I remember again, they just had a small budget of a couple $100, and that included my travel. So I was basically breaking even to go there. But I finished doing the gig. It went really well. And there's a lady who came up to me and introduced herself. And she said that her husband was actually the national director for FBLA. And she's like, you did an awesome job. I'm going to tell him about you. He needs to hire you for some of the national conferences.